Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into one of the most remarkable stories of courage, providence, and divine timing in all of human history. We're exploring the extraordinary account of a young Jewish woman who rose from obscurity to become queen of the most powerful empire on earth, and who ultimately risked everything to save her people from annihilation. This is the story of Esther, a tale that shows us how God works behind the scenes of history, positioning ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. It's about a woman who discovered that sometimes we are placed exactly where we need to be, precisely when we need to be there, for such a time as this. So without further ado, let's begin. In the 3rd year of his reign, when the power of Persia stretched like a golden net across the known world, King Xerxes decided to throw a party that would make the gods themselves take notice. From his winter palace in Susa, the administrative heart of an empire that spanned from the snow-capped mountains of India to the sun-baked sands of Ethiopia, the king commanded preparations for a celebration that would dwarf every royal festival in recorded history. The Persian Empire of 486 BC was not merely a kingdom, it was a phenomenon that had transformed the very concept of political power. Where previous empires had ruled through brute force and constant warfare, Persia had perfected the art of governance through brilliant administration and calculated tolerance. The genius of Cyrus the Great and his successors lay not just in their military conquests, but in their understanding that diverse peoples could be welded into a unified empire without destroying the cultural identities that made them unique. From the Aegean coast, where Greek city-states paid reluctant tribute, to the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia, where ancient Babylonian traditions continued to flourish, to the mysterious lands beyond the Indus River where exotic spices and precious stones flowed into Persian treasuries, the empire pulsed with a vitality that seemed almost supernatural. 127 provinces, each with its own languages, customs and local traditions, yet all bound together by the administrative brilliance of Persian governance and the terror-inspiring efficiency of Persian arms. The city of Susa itself was a marvel that left visitors speechless with wonder and envy. Built on the ruins of ancient Elamite kingdoms, it had been transformed by Persian architects and engineers into a showcase of imperial power that proclaimed the glory of the King of Kings to anyone who approached its massive gates. The Winter Palace complex sprawled across hundreds of acres, its buildings rising in terraces that seemed to climb toward heaven itself. The famous Persian postal system, with its network of royal roads and relay stations, converged on Susa like the spokes of a giant wheel. Mounted couriers thundered across thousands of miles of highway, carrying royal edicts and administrative commands that could reshape the destiny of entire nations within weeks of their composition. From the palace scribes' chambers, orders flowed outward that might call up armies from distant satrapies, redirect trade routes that carried the wealth of continents, or alter the religious practices of peoples whose ancestors had worshipped their gods for millennia. But it was the palace itself that truly captured the imagination and proclaimed the almost godlike power of its royal occupant. Massive columns of imported cedar soared toward ceilings decorated with gold leaf that caught and multiplied the light of countless oil lamps. Walls of polished marble bore intricate carvings that depicted the victories of Persian kings over their enemies, while floors of precious stones created patterns so complex that walking across them felt like treading on captured starlight. The throne room was the crown jewel of this architectural symphony, a space so vast that a man's voice would echo for several seconds after he finished speaking. The throne itself was carved from a single block of black marble, inlaid with precious metals and jewels that had been gathered from every corner of the known world. Behind it, tapestries woven from silk and gold thread told the story of Persian triumph, in images so vivid they seemed to move in the flickering lamplight. Yet for all its grandeur, the palace was also a place where human ambition and frailty played out their eternal dramas against a backdrop of almost unlimited power. Courtiers who had spent their entire careers learning to read the subtle signs of royal favour or displeasure moved through its corridors with the careful grace of dancers performing before an audience that held their lives in its hands. A single misplaced word, an inadvertent breach of protocol, or even an unfortunate coincidence of timing could transform a trusted advisor into a condemned prisoner in the space of a heartbeat. Among the peoples who had found themselves incorporated into this vast Persian tapestry were the Jews, descendants of those who had been carried into exile during the Babylonian conquest nearly a century earlier. When Cyrus the Great had overthrown the Babylonian Empire and established Persian hegemony over Mesopotamia, he had issued his famous decree allowing exiled peoples to return to their ancestral lands. Some Jews had indeed made the difficult journey back to Jerusalem and Judah, where they had begun the slow process of rebuilding their temple and their national identity. But many others had chosen to remain in the lands where they had been born, where their families had established businesses and built relationships that spanned generations. These Persian Jews had created a unique culture that blended their ancestral faith with the cosmopolitan realities of life in a polytheistic empire. They maintained their identity as the chosen people of the one true God, while adapting to the practical necessities of life among neighbours who worshipped the ancient deities of Mesopotamia and the newer Zoroastrian traditions that influenced Persian court culture. In cities throughout the empire, Jewish communities had established themselves as merchants, craftsmen, and administrators, whose skills and reliability had earned them positions of significant responsibility within the Persian system. They managed trade networks that spanned continents, served as interpreters and scribes in the multilingual bureaucracy, and even held military commands in the vast Persian army. Their reputation for honesty in business dealings and loyalty to their adopted homeland had generally protected them from the suspicion and persecution that often befell minority populations in ancient empires. Yet beneath this surface accommodation lay deeper currents of tension that reflected the fundamental incompatibility between Persian polytheism and Jewish monotheism. While the Persian policy of religious tolerance allowed Jews to maintain their distinctive practices and beliefs, it also created situations where loyalty to God and loyalty to empire might come into conflict. The question of how far a faithful Jew could go in accommodating pagan customs while maintaining spiritual integrity was one that every member of the diaspora community faced daily. This was the world into which King Xerxes unleashed his unprecedented celebration, a festival that would demonstrate Persian power and magnificence to representatives of every nation under Persian rule. The royal summons went out across the empire's efficient communication network, calling satraps and governors, military commanders and provincial administrators, wealthy merchants and influential local leaders to witness a display of imperial glory that would be remembered for generations. The preparations for this royal festival revealed both the vast resources at the Persian king's disposal and his deep understanding of how public spectacle could be used to reinforce political control. Artisans and craftsmen were summoned from every corner of the empire to create decorations that would transform the palace grounds into a wonderland of beauty and luxury. Cooks and vintners prepared feasts that would satisfy the palates of guests accustomed to the finest delicacies from their own cultures, while introducing them to exotic specialties from distant provinces. The guest list itself was a masterpiece of political calculation, carefully designed to reinforce the relationships and dependencies that held the empire together. Each invitation was both an honour and a subtle reminder of the recipient's place within the imperial hierarchy. To refuse such a summons would be interpreted as an act of rebellion. To attend was to acknowledge Persian supremacy and accept one's role as a subordinate within the imperial system. For 6 months, the Palace of Susa was transformed into a stage for the most elaborate performance of royal power that the ancient world had ever witnessed. Every day brought new demonstrations of Persian wealth and sophistication, from elaborate military parades that showcased the empire's diverse fighting forces to cultural presentations that highlighted the artistic achievements of its various peoples. The king himself appeared in different ceremonial costumes that reflected his authority over different regions and populations, each outfit worth more than most cities could accumulate in years of taxation. The wine flowed from every province where grapes could grow, while exotic foods demonstrated the empire's ability to transport perishable delicacies across vast distances without spoilage. Entertainment was provided by performers from every corner of the known world. musicians whose instruments produced sounds never before heard in Persian halls, dancers whose movements told stories from cultures so remote that their very existence had been legendary, athletes whose feats of strength and skill reflected training traditions that stretched back to the dawn of human civilization. But it was Queen Vashti who provided the most spectacular element of the royal celebration. Beautiful beyond the ability of poets to describe adequately, she presided over the women's festivities with a grace and dignity that perfectly complemented her husband's demonstration of masculine power. The Queen's beauty was not merely personal, it was political, a symbol of Persian refinement and superiority that proclaimed the empire's ability to attract and possess the finest examples of everything the world had to offer. Vashti's own background reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Persian royalty. Descended from noble families that traced their lineage back to the earliest days of Persian expansion, she had been educated in the sophisticated court culture that blended elements from every civilization that had fallen under Persian influence. She spoke multiple languages fluently, understood the religious and cultural sensitivities of different ethnic groups within the empire, and possessed the kind of political intelligence that made her a valuable advisor to the king on matters involving the complex dynamics of imperial governance. The relationship between Xerxes and Vashti represented more than a royal marriage. It was a partnership that embodied the Persian ideal of combining masculine strength with feminine wisdom. The king's public displays of power were balanced by the queen's more subtle influence over cultural and social matters. Where Xerxes commanded through the force of his authority, Vashti guided through the power of her intelligence and personal magnetism. Yet even in this atmosphere of celebration and apparent harmony, the seeds of crisis were already being planted. The very excess of the royal festival, the overwhelming display of wealth and power that was intended to inspire awe and loyalty, was also creating pressures and expectations that would prove impossible to sustain indefinitely. The king who had summoned the resources of an entire empire to create this unprecedented spectacle was setting standards for royal magnificence that would inevitably lead to ever more extreme demonstrations of imperial authority. On the 7th day of the festival, when wine had loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions throughout the palace, King Xerxes conceived an idea that seemed brilliant in his intoxicated state, but would prove catastrophic in its consequences. Surrounded by his drinking companions and dizzy with the success of his elaborate celebration, the king decided that his demonstration of Persian power would not be complete without displaying the ultimate prize in his possession, the incomparable beauty of Queen Vashti herself. The command that went out to the queen's chambers was unprecedented in its implications, and shocking in its disregard for established protocol. Vashti was ordered to appear before the assembled male guests wearing her royal crown, presumably to be displayed like a precious artifact for the appreciation of men whose judgment had been compromised by days of excessive drinking. The request violated every principle of royal dignity and feminine honour that had governed Persian court life since the empire's founding. Vashti's response was as swift as it was decisive. The queen, who had never before challenged her husband's authority, who had built her influence through careful diplomacy and strategic accommodation, suddenly drew a line that she would not cross. In a moment that would reverberate through history, she sent word to the king that she would not comply with his command. The queen would not parade herself before a gathering of intoxicated nobles like some trophy to be admired and evaluated. The silence that greeted Vashti's refusal was more profound than any sound that had echoed through the palace during the previous 6 months of celebration. In that moment of shocked stillness, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a direct challenge to royal authority that could not be ignored or explained away. The king, who had spent half a year demonstrating his absolute power over the greatest empire in human history, had been publicly defied by his own wife. Xerxes' reaction was swift and terrible to behold. The rage that consumed him was not merely personal but political, not simply the anger of a rejected husband, but the fury of a monarch whose authority had been questioned before witnesses whose respect was essential to the maintenance of imperial control. The king who had recently been praised for his wisdom and restraint was transformed into an embodiment of offended masculine pride and threatened royal prerogative. The consultation with his advisers that followed was less a deliberative process than a ratification of a decision that had already been made in the white heat of royal anger. The wise men who counselled the king understood that Vashti's fate had been sealed the moment she refused his summons. Their role was not to determine whether she should be punished, but to devise a punishment that would reinforce royal authority while serving as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to challenge the king's commands. The decree that removed Vashti from her position as queen was crafted with the cold precision of experienced politicians who understood the symbolic importance of their decision. This was not merely the punishment of one disobedient woman, but a statement about the fundamental nature of authority within the Persian Empire. The document that went out to every province proclaimed that husbands should be masters in their own households, that the example of royal authority should be reflected in every family relationship throughout the empire. Vashti vanished from the palace as suddenly as if she had never existed, her name erased from official records and her memory consigned to the whispered conversations of servants who remembered the days when she had graced the halls of Susa with her presence. The queen who had presided over the women's festivities with such dignity was replaced by an empty throne that seemed to mock the very celebration that had led to her downfall. But in the mysterious workings of divine providence, Vashti's fall was creating the opportunity for another woman to rise. Somewhere in the city of Susa, in a modest Jewish household that had no connection to the royal court, a young orphan named Hadassah was going about her daily routine. Unaware that the throne left vacant by the deposed queen's defiance was being prepared for her by the invisible hand of the God who works all things according to his purposes. The stage was set for a drama that would unfold far beyond the glittering halls of the Persian palace, a story that would demonstrate how the sovereign God of Israel could work through the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms to accomplish his redemptive purposes. Into the most unlikely of places, into the very heart of a pagan empire that seemed to represent everything opposed to the worship of the one true God, the Almighty was beginning to position his servant for the greatest test and the most crucial mission of her life. The morning after Vashti's banishment, King Xerxes awoke to the hollow reality of his empty palace. The wine had cleared from his system, the crowds of celebrating nobles had dispersed to their distant provinces, and the king found himself alone with the consequences of his rage-fueled decision. The throne beside his own remained conspicuously vacant, a daily reminder of the queen whose beauty had once been the crown jewel of his magnificent court. As weeks turned to months, the absence of a queen became more than a personal loss. It evolved into a political problem that threatened the very foundations of Persian royal protocol. The empire's complex ceremonial traditions required a queen's presence at state functions, while diplomatic relationships with other kingdoms depended on the kind of marriage alliances that only royal women could negotiate and seal. The king, who had acted decisively to preserve his authority, now found that authority diminished by the practical consequences of his solitary rule. It was the royal advisers, those same wise men who had counselled the swift removal of Vashti, who proposed a solution that would transform the crisis into an opportunity for imperial aggrandizement. Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, they suggested, their voices carefully modulated to convey respectful counsel, rather than presumptuous direction. Let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel to the women's quarters. The proposal was audacious in its scope, and unprecedented in its democratic implications. Instead of arranging a traditional royal marriage with the daughter of some neighbouring monarch or powerful Persian noble family, Xerxes would select his new queen from among the most beautiful women in the entire empire. Every province, every ethnic group, every social class would have the opportunity to present their finest daughters for royal consideration. The royal edict that proclaimed this empire-wide search for a new queen sent shockwaves through every corner of the Persian domain. Local officials scrambled to organise beauty competitions that would identify candidates worthy of imperial attention, while families with eligible daughters faced impossible decisions about whether to put their children forward for consideration. The honour of potentially becoming queen had to be weighed against the reality that entering the royal harem meant leaving one's family and community forever, regardless of whether one was ultimately chosen for the throne. The logistics of gathering beautiful young women from 127 provinces presented challenges that tested even Persian administrative efficiency. Royal commissioners fanned out across the empire with authority to commandeer transportation, requisition supplies, and overcome any local resistance to their mission. They travelled routes that spanned thousands of miles, crossing mountain ranges and deserts, navigating rivers and seas, to reach communities so remote that news of the king's decision took months to arrive. In the Jewish quarter of Susa, the royal proclamation created particular consternation among families who had spent generations carefully balancing their loyalty to the Persian crown with their commitment to the faith of their ancestors. The prospect of a Jewish daughter entering the king's harem raised profound questions about religious identity and spiritual compromise that had no easy answers. How could a young woman maintain her covenant relationship with the God of Israel while participating in the elaborate pagan rituals that surrounded Persian royalty? It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty and upheaval that the royal commissioner's attention fell upon a young woman whose beauty was so remarkable that it transcended cultural boundaries and rendered religious considerations temporarily irrelevant. Hadassah, known by her Persian name Esther, possessed the kind of extraordinary physical attractiveness that could stop conversations in the marketplace and turn heads in the synagogue with equal effectiveness. But Esther's beauty was only the most obvious of her remarkable qualities. Orphaned at an early age when both her parents died in one of the plague epidemics that periodically swept through the crowded urban quarters of the Persian capital, she had been raised by her older cousin Mordecai with a care and devotion that reflected the deepest traditions of Jewish family loyalty. Under his guidance, she had developed not only the grace and poise that made her beauty truly captivating, but also the intelligence and character that would prove far more valuable than mere physical attractiveness. Mordecai himself was a figure of considerable importance within the Jewish community of Susa, a man whose wisdom and integrity had earned him respect that transcended ethnic boundaries. His position at the king's gate was no mere ceremonial appointment, but indicated his role within the Persian bureaucratic system that governed the empire's daily operations. The king's gate was where the real business of administration was conducted, where petitions were heard and decisions made that affected the lives of millions of imperial subjects. As a member of the tribe of Benjamin, and a descendant of those who had been carried into exile during the Babylonian conquests, Mordecai embodied the complex identity that characterized Persian Jews of his generation. He was simultaneously a loyal subject of the Persian crown and a faithful member of the people Israel, a man who could navigate the intricacies of imperial politics while maintaining his commitment to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When the royal commissioners came to claim Esther for the king's consideration, Mordecai faced a decision that would have profound implications far beyond his own family. He could have hidden his beloved cousin, could have arranged for her to flee to some distant province where the royal search might not reach. Instead, he chose to entrust her to a process that he could not control, guided by a faith that saw divine purpose even in circumstances that seemed to threaten everything he held dear. The instruction that Mordecai gave to Esther as she prepared to enter the royal palace revealed both his political wisdom and his spiritual insight. "Do not reveal your people or family," he counseled, understanding that anti-Jewish sentiment could surface at any time within the volatile environment of royal politics. The decision to conceal Esther's ethnic identity was not an act of cowardice, but a strategic choice that would preserve her ability to serve her people if circumstances ever required such service. Esther's entrance into the royal harem marked the beginning of a transformation process that was as comprehensive as it was lengthy. The Persian system for preparing potential queens was a masterpiece of ancient beauty culture, a 12-month regimen that combined physical enhancement with cultural education in ways designed to create the perfect royal companion. The first 6 months of preparation involved treatments with oil of myrrh, a precious substance imported from distant Arabian kingdoms, at costs that could fund small military campaigns. This exotic unguent was believed to possess almost magical properties, capable of enhancing natural beauty while imbuing the skin with a luminous quality that seemed to glow from within. The daily application of myrrh oil was accompanied by elaborate bathing rituals using waters perfumed with rare flowers and minerals gathered from every corner of the empire. The second half of the preparation period introduced an even more complex array of cosmetics and perfumes that reflected the sophisticated beauty standards of Persian court culture. Kohl from Egypt outlined eyes with dramatic precision, while rouge from distant Phoenician cities enhanced the natural bloom of youth. Perfumes blended from ingredients so rare that their very names were whispered secrets among the palace attendants created personal fragrances that were as unique as fingerprints. But the physical preparation was only one aspect of the comprehensive education that potential queens received during their year in the royal harem. These young women, gathered from every corner of the known world, represented dozens of different cultures and languages. They had to be taught Persian court etiquette, instructed in the complex protocols that governed royal behaviour, and educated in the political and religious traditions that shaped imperial policy. The harem itself was a small city within the palace complex, governed by eunuchs whose authority was absolute within their designated sphere. Chief among these was Haggai, the keeper of the women, whose responsibility for the king's potential brides made him one of the most powerful individuals in the entire Persian administration. His favour could smooth a candidate's path to royal attention, while his displeasure could effectively end any hope of becoming queen. Esther's relationship with Haggai proved crucial to her success within this competitive environment. The young Jewish woman's natural grace and intelligence quickly won the eunuch's approval, earning her special treatment that set her apart from the other candidates. The young woman pleased him and won his favour, the ancient chroniclers recorded, noting how Haggai provided Esther with the finest cosmetics, the choicest foods, and 7 specially selected maids to attend to her needs. The special apartment that Haggai arranged for Esther was more than mere favouritism. It was a strategic positioning that reflected his professional assessment of her potential to actually become queen. The eunuch who had overseen the selection and preparation of royal women for decades understood the subtle qualities that distinguish true royalty from mere beauty, and he recognised in Esther the combination of physical attractiveness, intelligence, and character that kings found irresistible. Throughout this transformative year, Mordecai maintained his vigilant watch over his beloved cousin's welfare. Every day he walked back and forth in front of the court of the women's quarters, seeking news of Esther's condition and well-being. This daily pilgrimage was not merely the concern of a loving guardian, but the careful surveillance of a man who understood that larger purposes might be at work in these seemingly coincidental events. The other young women in the harem represented a cross-section of imperial beauty and ambition that reflected the vast diversity of Persian rule. There were daughters of Greek nobility, whose classical features embodied Mediterranean ideals of feminine perfection. Nubian princesses brought the exotic allure of African royalty, while the daughters of Indian Rajas carried themselves with the mysterious dignity of the Far East. Each possessed qualities that might appeal to royal taste. Each had been selected from among thousands of candidates in their home provinces. Yet as the months passed and the year of preparation neared its end, it became increasingly clear that Esther possessed something that transcended mere physical beauty or cultural sophistication. The young woman who had entered the harem as an orphan from the Jewish quarter was emerging as a figure whose presence seemed to transform every environment she entered. The maids assigned to serve her became devoted to her welfare. The eunuchs responsible for her training praised her quick intelligence and gracious demeanour, and even her fellow candidates found themselves drawn to her warmth and authenticity. When Esther's appointed time finally came to appear before King Xerxes, she requested nothing beyond what Haggai recommended for her presentation. This decision revealed both her wisdom and her humility. Wisdom in trusting the judgment of someone who understood royal preferences better than she ever could, and humility in not allowing the year of special treatment to inflate her sense of self-importance. The night that would determine Esther's destiny arrived with all the ceremony and anticipation that surrounded royal audiences in the Persian court. She was dressed in garments that represented the finest textile arts of the empire, adorned with jewels that had been gathered from every corner of the known world and perfumed with fragrances so precious that their cost could have purchased entire cities. But it was not the external enhancements that captured the king's attention when Esther entered his presence. Xerxes, who had seen hundreds of beautiful women during the selection process, who had grown somewhat jaded by the parade of carefully prepared candidates, found himself genuinely surprised by the young woman who stood before him. Here was beauty that seemed to emanate from some inner source, grace that appeared natural rather than calculated, an intelligence that sparkled in eyes that met his gaze with respectful confidence rather than fearful submission. The king's reaction was immediate and decisive. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, the court chroniclers recorded, noting how she obtained grace and favour in his sight more than all the virgins. The monarch, who had spent months evaluating potential queens, discovered that his choice had been made for him the moment this remarkable young woman entered his presence. The royal wedding that followed was a celebration that rivaled even the legendary festival that had led to Vashti's downfall. Xerxes proclaimed a holiday throughout all his provinces, released prisoners as an act of royal magnanimity, and distributed gifts with the kind of generous excess that characterized Persian displays of imperial wealth. The orphan from the Jewish quarter of Susa was transformed into Queen Esther, second only to the king himself in the hierarchy of the most powerful empire on earth. Yet even as she accepted the golden crown that made her queen of 127 provinces, Esther maintained the secret that Mordecai had counselled her to keep. Her Jewish identity remained hidden, known only to her cousin who continued his daily vigil at the palace gates. The new queen, who had been chosen from among the most beautiful women in the world, carried within her heart the knowledge that she was first and foremost a daughter of the covenant people, a descendant of those who had been called to be a light to the nations. The coronation ceremonies that established Esther as queen were conducted according to ancient Persian traditions that invoked the blessings of Ahura Mazda and the sacred fires that had burned in Zoroastrian temples since the empire's founding. The young Jewish woman who participated in these pagan rituals maintained her hidden identity while navigating the complex religious landscape of imperial politics. She was learning to be queen while remaining true to the faith that defined her deepest identity. In the months that followed her elevation to the throne, Esther proved to be everything that Xerxes and his advisors had hoped for in a royal consort. She displayed the dignity and grace that Persian court culture demanded, while her intelligence and political instincts made her a valuable advisor on matters of state. The king, who had chosen her for her beauty, discovered that he had gained a partner whose wisdom and character exceeded even her remarkable physical attractiveness. But perhaps most importantly, Esther was learning to wield the power and influence that came with her position as queen. The orphan who had depended on Mordecai's guidance was becoming a woman who could navigate the treacherous waters of imperial politics with growing confidence and skill. She was building relationships with court officials, understanding the complex dynamics that shaped policy decisions, and establishing herself as a force to be reckoned with in the halls of Persian power. The transformation was remarkable to observe. The young woman who had entered the harem as a candidate among many had become the queen whose word could shape the destiny of nations. Yet she remained mindful of the cousin who had raised her with such devotion, maintaining communication with Mordecai through the network of servants and officials who moved between the palace and the outside world. Neither Esther nor Mordecai could have imagined, as they adapted to the new realities of her royal status, that forces were already at work that would test every lesson she had learned about leadership, every relationship she had built within the palace hierarchy, and every aspect of the faith that remained hidden in her heart. The God who had positioned her on the throne of the Persian Empire was preparing her for a trial that would reveal whether the orphan who had become a queen possessed the courage to risk everything for the salvation of her people. In the mysterious workings of divine providence, unseen hands were already moving the pieces on the chessboard of history. The beautiful young woman who had been chosen from among thousands of candidates was being prepared for a destiny that would prove whether she had indeed come to the kingdom for such a time as this. 5 years into Esther's reign as queen, King Xerxes made a decision that would unleash forces of evil beyond anything the Persian Empire had previously witnessed. In a ceremony of unprecedented grandeur, he elevated a man named Haman the Agagite to the position of prime minister, granting him authority second only to the king himself throughout all 127 provinces of the realm. The promotion was announced with fanfare that echoed across the empire, accompanied by royal edicts that commanded every subject to show Haman the kind of reverence normally reserved for royalty itself. Haman's rise to power was meteoric and mysterious, the kind of political ascension that court observers struggled to explain through normal channels of influence and merit. Unlike other high officials who had built their careers through military service, administrative competence, or family connections, Haman seemed to have emerged from relative obscurity to capture the king's favour through means that remained opaque to even the most seasoned palace watchers. The new prime minister's background, however, carried significance that extended far beyond the immediate politics of the Persian court. As an Agagite, Haman was descended from the ancient Amalekites, a people whose enmity with Israel stretched back to the earliest days of Jewish history. When the Israelites had wandered in the wilderness after their exodus from Egypt, it was the Amalekites who had attacked them without provocation, targeting the weak and defenceless among God's people with a cruelty that had earned them divine condemnation. King Saul's failure to completely destroy the Amalekites, particularly his decision to spare King Agag contrary to God's explicit command, had allowed this bloodline of hatred to survive and eventually flourish in exile. Now, centuries later, a descendant of that spared king had risen to a position of supreme power within the very empire, where the scattered children of Israel sought to rebuild their lives and maintain their ancient faith. The royal decree that accompanied Haman's elevation was unprecedented in its scope and implications. All the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, the official proclamation declared, for so the king had commanded concerning him. This was not merely a protocol of respect, but a requirement of worship, an acknowledgement of Haman's almost divine status within the imperial hierarchy. The command to bow before Haman created immediate tension throughout the Persian bureaucracy, where officials from dozens of different cultures and religious traditions struggled to balance their personal beliefs with the demands of imperial service. For most, the requirement posed no serious spiritual conflict. Persian political culture had always included elaborate protocols of deference to authority, and bowing before high officials was a well-established custom that carried no deeper religious significance. But for one man, the royal command presented an impossible choice between obedience to earthly authority and loyalty to the God of his fathers. Mordecai the Jew, Esther's beloved cousin who had continued his daily vigil at the palace gates throughout her reign as queen, found himself confronted with a demand that struck at the very heart of his faith and identity. The requirement to bow before Haman was not merely a matter of civil courtesy, but a form of worship that violated the fundamental commandment that had defined Jewish identity since Mount Sinai. The God who had declared, "You shall have no other gods before me," had made it clear that his people were to bow before no earthly power, regardless of the personal or political consequences of such defiance. For Mordecai, the decision was both agonizing and inevitable. He had spent decades navigating the complex demands of life as a faithful Jew within a pagan empire, finding ways to serve his adopted homeland while maintaining his spiritual integrity. He had risen to a position of significant responsibility within the Persian administrative system, earning respect from colleagues and superiors who valued his wisdom and reliability. All of this would be jeopardized by his refusal to comply with the king's command regarding Haman. Yet when the moment of testing came, Mordecai's response was unambiguous and unwavering. Day after day, as other officials prostrated themselves before the prime minister, the Jewish administrator remained standing, his dignity intact but his future uncertain. The sight of this solitary figure refusing to acknowledge Haman's supremacy quickly became the subject of intense speculation and growing tension throughout the palace complex. Haman's initial reaction to Mordecai's defiance was a mixture of surprise and irritation, rather than the explosive rage that would eventually consume him. As someone newly elevated to supreme power, the Prime Minister was still adjusting to the deference and worship that his position commanded. The sight of one stubborn official refusing to bow was initially more puzzling than infuriating to a man who was still learning to expect universal submission. But as days turned to weeks, and Mordecai's refusal continued unabated, Haman's irritation began to transform into something far more dangerous. The Prime Minister, who had risen to power through political manoeuvring, discovered that he possessed a pride so vast and a need for validation so intense that even a single act of defiance could trigger psychological collapse into obsessive hatred. The other court officials, recognizing the explosive potential of the situation, attempted to intervene before the conflict escalated beyond control. "Why do you transgress the king's command?" they asked Mordecai, their voices carrying a mixture of genuine concern and political calculation. They understood that his continued defiance would inevitably provoke a response that could destroy not only Mordecai himself, but potentially implicate anyone associated with him. Mordecai's explanation of his refusal was both simple and profound. He had told them that he was a Jew, the court chroniclers recorded, noting how his religious identity provided the only explanation necessary for his behaviour. This was not personal animosity toward Haman or deliberate insubordination toward royal authority, but the inevitable consequence of a faith that recognized no earthly power as worthy of worship. The revelation of Mordecai's Jewish identity added a new and ominous dimension to the growing conflict. Haman, whose Agagite heritage had already predisposed him toward hatred of Israel's descendants, suddenly found his personal grievance transformed into something approaching a holy war. The Prime Minister, who had been merely irritated by one man's defiance, was now consumed by a rage that encompassed an entire people and their ancient faith. As Haman's anger festered and grew, it began to take on characteristics that transcended rational political calculation and entered the realm of pathological obsession. The slight that had initially seemed manageable through normal administrative channels was being magnified by forces of ancestral hatred and spiritual darkness that transformed personal offence into genocidal fury. The Prime Minister's daily encounters with Mordecai's quiet defiance became a form of psychological torture that poisoned every aspect of his existence. Each morning brought a fresh reminder of his inability to command universal submission. Each afternoon reinforced his sense that his authority was being mocked by a stubborn Jew who refused to acknowledge his supremacy. The power that should have brought Haman satisfaction instead became a source of constant torment. But it was the realization that Mordecai's defiance represented something larger than individual rebellion that finally pushed Haman over the edge into murderous insanity. The Prime Minister began to understand that he was not merely dealing with one stubborn official, but with a people whose entire religious and cultural identity was fundamentally incompatible with the kind of absolute authority he demanded. Haman thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, the ancient chroniclers recorded with chilling understatement. The Prime Minister's rage had expanded beyond its original target to encompass every Jew throughout the Persian Empire. If Mordecai's defiance stemmed from his Jewish identity, then the solution was obvious. Eliminate not just the individual rebel, but the entire people whose faith made such rebellion inevitable. The decision to pursue genocide rather than simple assassination revealed both the scope of Haman's evil and the calculated intelligence that made him so dangerous. A lesser villain might have simply arranged for Mordecai's death and considered the matter closed. But Haman understood that killing one Jew would only create a martyr while leaving the underlying problem unsolved. If Jewish faith naturally produced resistance to proper authority, then Jewish faith itself had to be exterminated. The planning that went into Haman's genocidal scheme demonstrated the methodical precision of a man who had not lost his rationality, even as he embraced ultimate evil. Rather than acting in the heat of anger, the Prime Minister carefully researched the most auspicious timing for his proposed massacre, consulting the ancient divination practices that had guided Persian decision-making for generations. The casting of lots, Purim in the Persian language, was both a religious ritual and a strategic calculation, designed to determine when the cosmic forces would be most favourable for such a momentous undertaking. Day by day and month by month, Haman cast the lots before his household gods, seeking divine approval for his intended destruction of an entire people. The irony was profound. A descendant of the Amalekites was consulting pagan deities for guidance in completing the work of extermination that his ancestors had begun in the wilderness centuries earlier. The lots finally settled on the 13th day of the 12th month, called Adar, nearly a full year in the future. This lengthy delay was not merely superstitious adherence to divination results, but shrewd political strategy that would allow time for careful preparation and coordination across the vast expanse of the Persian Empire. Genocide on the scale that Haman envisioned required meticulous planning and substantial resources that could not be assembled overnight. Armed with what he believed to be divine sanction for his evil enterprise, Haman approached King Xerxes with a proposal that was masterfully crafted to appeal to royal concerns while concealing the personal hatred that actually motivated it. The Prime Minister, who had risen to power through political sophistication, understood exactly how to present genocide as good governance. "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom," Haman began, his words carefully chosen to emphasize the threat that Jewish distinctiveness supposedly posed to imperial unity. "Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain." The accusation was both clever and devastating in its implications. Haman was not presenting his hatred as a religious or ethnic conflict, but as a matter of imperial security and administrative efficiency. These Jews, he argued, represented a threat to the very foundations of Persian rule through their refusal to fully integrate into the imperial system. Their separate laws and customs created parallel authority structures that undermined royal sovereignty throughout the empire. The financial incentive that Haman offered, along with his genocidal proposal, revealed both his personal wealth and his understanding of how Persian politics actually functioned. "If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed," he continued, "and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasuries." 10,000 talents of silver represented a staggering sum of money, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars in modern currency. The offer demonstrated that Haman was not merely seeking royal permission for genocide, but was prepared to personally finance the operation with resources that exceeded the annual tax revenue of entire provinces. This was not the proposal of a casual bigot, but the calculated investment of a man whose hatred had consumed his rational self-interest. King Xerxes' response to Haman's proposal revealed the moral bankruptcy that had come to characterize his reign in the years since Vashti's banishment. The monarch who had once shown flashes of wisdom and restraint now displayed a casual indifference to the lives of his subjects that bordered on the psychopathic. Without requesting additional information, without consulting other advisors, without even inquiring about the specific charges against these people, the king gave his approval to mass murder. The king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the court chroniclers recorded with stark simplicity. The transfer of the royal seal was more than symbolic delegation of authority. It was the legal equivalent of the king himself, authorizing every aspect of the coming genocide. Haman now possessed the power to issue edicts that carried the full force of imperial law throughout all 127 provinces of the Persian realm. The document that emerged from the royal chancellery was a masterpiece of administrative efficiency applied to ultimate evil. Written in the various languages and scripts of the empire's diverse populations, sealed with the king's ring, and distributed through the sophisticated Persian postal system, the edict transformed Haman's personal hatred into imperial policy with terrifying speed and reach. Letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces, the ancient chroniclers noted, describing how the death warrant for an entire people spread across the known world with the same efficiency that normally carried routine administrative instructions. To destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. The thoroughness of the planned massacre was breathtaking in its scope and chilling in its specificity. This was not merely a military campaign against Jewish political leaders or religious authorities, but a systematic extermination that would spare no one. Not the elderly who posed no threat to anyone, not the children who had never heard of Mordecai's defiance, not the women whose only crime was bearing Jewish blood. The edict authorized not just murder, but plunder, ensuring that economic incentives would supplement religious and ethnic hatred in motivating participation in the genocide. The date selected for the massacre, nearly a year in the future, revealed the cold calculation behind Haman's evil enterprise. This lengthy delay would allow provincial governors time to organize the logistics of mass murder, while also serving the psychological purpose of creating prolonged terror among the intended victims. Jewish communities throughout the empire would spend months knowing exactly when their destruction was scheduled, watching the calendar count down to their appointed annihilation. The reaction throughout the Persian Empire to the publication of this genocidal edict was as swift as it was polarized. In the capital city of Susa, the contrast between official celebration and popular horror could not have been more stark. The king and Haman sat down to drink, the chroniclers recorded with bitter irony, noting how the architects of genocide celebrated their accomplishment with wine, while the city around them descended into chaos and confusion. The immediate impact on Jewish communities was devastating beyond description. Families who had spent generations building lives and businesses within the Persian system suddenly found themselves marked for death by the very government they had served faithfully. The edict that transformed them from protected subjects into hunted prey came without warning or explanation, leaving entire communities struggling to comprehend how their world had changed so completely overnight. But perhaps most tragic of all was the realization that their destruction had been decreed not for any crime they had committed or any threat they posed, but simply because one man's pride could not tolerate another man's faithfulness to God. The genocide that threatened to eliminate Jewish presence from the Persian Empire had its origins in the simple decision of a faithful man to bow before the Lord rather than before a human authority figure who demanded worship. As news of the edict spread throughout the empire and Jewish communities began to grasp the magnitude of the threat they faced, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test whether the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still possessed the power to deliver his people from their enemies. The shadow of annihilation had fallen across the Jewish diaspora, and evil schemes had gained ground with terrifying efficiency. All that remained to be seen was whether anyone would possess the courage to stand against the forces of darkness that threatened to complete the work of extermination that had begun in the wilderness centuries earlier. The news of Haman's genocidal edict reached the Jewish quarter of Susa like a thunderbolt from a clear sky, transforming a community that had known relative peace and prosperity for generations into a population marked for death. Within hours of the royal proclamation being posted in the city's public spaces, the streets that had once echoed with the sounds of normal commerce and conversation fell silent, except for the wailing of those who understood that their destruction had been scheduled with the precision of a royal calendar. Mordecai's reaction to the edict was immediate and visceral, the response of a man who suddenly comprehended that his principled stand against Haman had unleashed forces that threatened to destroy everyone he loved. The Jewish administrator who had maintained his dignity and composure through years of palace politics was transformed into a figure of absolute grief, tearing his clothes in the ancient gesture of mourning and covering himself with sackcloth and ashes as he wandered through the streets of the capital crying out in anguish. The sight of this respected court official reduced to such visible despair sent shockwaves through both the Jewish community and the broader population of Susa. Mordecai had always been known for his wisdom and self-control, his ability to navigate complex political situations with steady nerves and careful calculation. To see him walking through the city in mourning clothes, his voice raised in lamentation that could be heard from blocks away, was to understand that something unprecedented and terrible had occurred. But even in his grief, Mordecai's mind was working with the clarity that had made him valuable to successive Persian administrations. As he processed the implications of Haman's edict, one fact stood out with crystalline clarity. There was one person who might possess the power and position necessary to intervene in this catastrophe. His beloved cousin Esther, the orphan girl he had raised as his own daughter, now sat on the throne of the Persian Empire with influence that could potentially reach even the heart of King Xerxes. Yet the very thought of involving Esther in this crisis filled Mordecai with anguish that went beyond his fear for his people's survival. The young woman who had been chosen as queen precisely because of her beauty and grace would be risking everything if she attempted to intercede for the Jews. Palace life had insulated her from the harsh realities that other Persian Jews faced daily, but it had also made her vulnerable in ways that ordinary subjects could hardly imagine. The communication between Mordecai and Esther had to be managed with extreme delicacy, conducted through intermediaries who could move between the palace and the outside world without attracting unwanted attention. The queen's personal servant, Hattach, became the crucial link in this desperate chain of communication, carrying messages that would determine whether an entire people lived or died. When Hattach brought word to Queen Esther that her cousin was mourning publicly in sackcloth and ashes, her immediate reaction was concern for his personal welfare, rather than comprehension of the larger crisis. The queen, who had been shielded from the harsh realities of imperial politics, sent garments to replace Mordecai's mourning clothes, hoping to restore his normal appearance and dignity. Her response revealed both her genuine love for the man who had raised her and her dangerous ignorance of the forces that had been unleashed against her people. Mordecai's refusal of the replacement garments sent a clear signal that this was no ordinary court crisis that could be resolved through normal diplomatic channels. When Hattach returned to report that the Jewish official would not abandon his mourning clothes, Esther understood that she was facing something far more serious than a temporary political setback or personal grievance. The detailed explanation that Mordecai provided through Hattach was devastating in its implications and clarity. Not only did he describe the content of Haman's edict in all its genocidal specificity, but he also provided a copy of the royal decree that had been posted throughout Susa. The document that Esther read in the privacy of her royal chambers was not a rumour or exaggeration, but the official death warrant for her people, sealed with her husband's own ring, and distributed throughout all 127 provinces of the empire. But perhaps most shocking of all was Mordecai's explicit instruction about what Esther must do in response to this crisis. Charge her to go into the king, to make supplication to him, and plead before him for her people, he commanded, using language that left no room for misunderstanding or excuse. The man who had once counselled concealment of her Jewish identity was now demanding that she reveal everything in a desperate attempt to save their people from annihilation. Esther's initial response to this demand revealed both the genuine dangers she faced and the psychological distance that royal privilege had created between her and the Jewish community. "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know," she replied through Hattach, "that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king, who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden sceptre, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. The protocol that Esther described was not mere court etiquette, but a matter of life and death that reflected the absolute nature of Persian royal authority. The king, who ruled over 127 provinces with unlimited power, could not allow his time and attention to be subject to the random demands of courtiers and family members. The golden sceptre that could spare an uninvited visitor's life was extended only at the king's complete discretion, and there was no appeal from his decision to withhold it. The mention of 30 days without a royal summons added another layer of complexity to Esther's predicament. In the volatile environment of Persian court life, a month without access to the king could indicate anything from simple scheduling conflicts to serious displeasure that might signal impending disfavour. Esther had no way of knowing whether an uninvited appearance might be welcomed as a pleasant surprise or interpreted as presumptuous intrusion that deserved the death penalty. Mordecai's response to Esther's explanation of the dangers she faced was both compassionate and ruthlessly logical, reflecting the depth of his understanding about the forces they were confronting. The message he sent back through Hattach would become one of the most famous declarations of faith and responsibility in human history, words that would inspire courage in countless individuals facing impossible choices between safety and duty. "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews," Mordecai began, his words cutting through any illusions about royal privilege providing protection from Haman's genocidal intentions. The Prime Minister, who had already demonstrated his willingness to pursue systematic extermination, would hardly spare the Queen simply because she happened to be married to the king. If anything, the discovery that the Queen herself was Jewish would provide Haman with an additional triumph that would enhance his standing with Xerxes. But it was Mordecai's next words that transformed his message from a mere warning into a prophetic declaration that placed Esther's crisis within the larger context of divine purpose. "For if you remain completely silent at this time," he continued, "relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish." The statement revealed both Mordecai's absolute faith in God's covenant faithfulness and his understanding that divine purposes could be accomplished through multiple instruments. The God who had promised to preserve the descendants of Abraham would not allow Haman's evil schemes to succeed, regardless of whether Esther chose to act or not. But her refusal to embrace the opportunity for service would not only result in her own destruction, but would mean that she had forfeited the privilege of participating in her people's deliverance. It was Mordecai's final words, however, that would echo through history as one of the most powerful statements ever made about divine timing and human responsibility. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The question was both profound and practical, challenging Esther to consider whether her unlikely elevation from orphan to queen might have been orchestrated by the God of Israel for precisely this moment of crisis. The concept that Mordecai articulated, that seemingly random events might actually be divine preparation for crucial moments of decision, struck at the heart of how faithful people should understand their circumstances and opportunities. Esther's beauty, her selection among thousands of candidates, her favour with the king, and even her concealed Jewish identity, all suddenly appeared as elements of a larger plan that had been designed to position her for this very crisis. The theological implications of Mordecai's challenge were staggering in their scope and personal application. If indeed the God of Israel had been orchestrating events to place Esther on the Persian throne at precisely the moment when her people faced annihilation, then her current crisis was not an unfortunate coincidence, but a divine appointment that would test everything she claimed to believe about faith, courage, and responsibility. Esther's response to her cousin's challenge marked a turning point not only in her personal character, but in the entire trajectory of the crisis that threatened to destroy Persian Jewry. The young woman who'd been chosen as queen because of her physical beauty was about to discover whether she possessed the inner strength necessary to risk everything for others' survival. "Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan," Esther commanded through Hatash, her words carrying a new note of authority and determination that revealed her transformation from passive beauty to active agent. "And fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go into the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." The decision to call for a 3-day fast was not merely a request for moral support, but a recognition that the crisis she faced transcended human political maneuvering and required divine intervention. Fasting had been a crucial element of Jewish spiritual practice since the earliest days of their covenant relationship with God, a way of demonstrating dependence on divine provision while seeking God's favour in times of desperate need. The fact that Esther included her Persian maids in this fast revealed how completely she was abandoning the pretense that had protected her Jewish identity throughout her reign as queen. The servants who attended her daily needs would inevitably learn through this experience that their royal mistress belonged to the people marked for destruction by Haman's edict. But Esther was beyond caring about such considerations. The time for concealment had passed, and the moment for complete commitment had arrived. But it was Esther's final declaration, "If I perish, I perish," that revealed the depth of her transformation and the completeness of her surrender to divine purpose. These words were not spoken in despair or fatalistic resignation, but in the kind of settled courage that comes only from absolute conviction that some things are worth dying for. The queen, who had enjoyed every privilege and protection that royal status could provide, was choosing to risk everything for people she barely knew, simply because they shared the covenant identity that defined her deepest self. The 3 days of fasting that followed became a period of spiritual preparation that transformed not only Esther herself, but the entire Jewish community of Susa. As word spread through the Jewish quarter that the queen was preparing to risk her life in an attempt to save her people, the despair that had gripped the community began to give way to something approaching hope. Here was evidence that the God of Israel had not abandoned his people, but had been preparing for this very crisis through the unlikely instrument of a young woman, whose beauty had won a king's heart. The fast itself was comprehensive in its scope and intensity, involving not only abstinence from food and drink, but also from all the normal activities that characterize daily life. This was not merely a symbolic gesture, but a complete turning away from earthly concerns, in order to focus entirely on seeking divine intervention in circumstances that seemed hopeless from any human perspective. For Esther personally, these 3 days of fasting and prayer represented a period of spiritual preparation that would prove as crucial as any physical or political preparation she might have made. The young woman who had learned to navigate the complexities of court life was now learning to depend completely on the God of her fathers, seeking wisdom and courage that could only come from divine sources. As the 3 days drew to a close and the moment of decision approached, Esther found herself transformed from the frightened young woman who had initially resisted Mordecai's challenge into someone who possessed a peace and determination that transcended her circumstances. The queen, who had once feared to approach the king uninvited, was now prepared to walk into his presence, clothed not in royal garments, but in the kind of faith that had sustained her people through centuries of exile and persecution. The turning point of courage had been reached, and the queen had accepted her calling. The orphan who had been raised by a faithful Jewish man had discovered that she possessed the strength necessary to risk everything for others' survival. The woman who had come to the kingdom had finally understood that she had indeed been positioned for such a time as this. As Esther prepared to enter the presence of the most powerful man on earth to plead for the lives of a people marked for death, she carried with her not only the hopes of Persian Jewry, but the prayers of everyone who had joined her in seeking divine intervention in seemingly impossible circumstances. The moment had arrived when faith would either prove sufficient for the crisis at hand, or would be revealed as inadequate for the challenges that real life could present. The next few hours would determine whether the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still possessed the power to deliver his people from their enemies, and whether one young woman's courage could serve as the instrument through which such deliverance might come. The 3rd day of fasting dawned with an intensity that seemed to charge the very air around the Persian palace with electric anticipation. Throughout the Jewish quarter of Susa, families who had spent 3 days in prayer and supplication now waited in hushed silence for word of their queen's fate. The sun that rose over the capital city illuminated a community that had wrestled with God and emerged with something approaching hope, despite the death warrant that still hung over their heads like a sword suspended by the thinnest of threads. In her private chambers, Queen Esther completed the most important preparation of her life. The physical transformation that accompanied her decision to approach the king, uninvited, was as dramatic as the spiritual preparation that had preceded it. Gone were the simple garments and modest appearance that had characterized her 3 days of fasting. In their place, she donned her full royal regalia, the elaborate gown woven from silk and gold thread that proclaimed her status as Queen of the Persian Empire. The jewels that had been gathered from every corner of the known world to adorn her person, and most importantly, the golden crown that marked her as the highest-ranking woman in the most powerful kingdom on earth. But this was not merely a matter of court protocol or feminine vanity. Esther understood with crystal clarity that her appearance, when she entered the king's presence, could mean the difference between life and death, not only for herself but for every Jew in the Persian Empire. The beauty that had first captured Xerxes' attention and won his heart would now be deployed as a weapon in spiritual warfare, a tool in the hands of divine providence to accomplish purposes that transcended mere human politics. As her servants arranged the final details of her royal appearance, Esther found herself thinking not of the honours and privileges that her position had brought her, but of the orphan girl she had once been in Mordecai's household. The contrast was almost incomprehensible, from a parentless child dependent on her cousin's kindness, to the queen of an empire that spanned 3 continents. Yet now she understood that every step of that unlikely journey had been preparation for this single moment, when everything would be risked on one desperate gamble for her people's survival. The walk from her private quarters to the inner court of the palace had never seemed so long or so fraught with significance. Each step carried her further from the safety of her royal privileges and closer to a confrontation that could end her life within moments of its beginning. The corridors that had once felt familiar and welcoming now seemed charged with menace, every shadow potentially concealing dangers that she could neither predict nor control. The inner court itself was a marvel of Persian architectural achievement, designed to inspire awe and reinforce the absolute authority of the king who held court within its confines. Massive columns of imported marble soared toward a ceiling decorated with gold leaf that caught and multiplied the light streaming through cleverly placed openings. The floor was a masterpiece of stonework that created patterns so intricate that walking across them felt like treading on captured art. But it was the throne itself that commanded attention and inspired either reverence or terror, depending on the observer's relationship with its occupant. Carved from a single block of black marble and inlaid with precious metals and gems from every corner of the empire, it rose like a monument to absolute power in the centre of the vast chamber. Behind it, tapestries depicting Persian victories over their enemies served as a constant reminder of what happened to those who challenged royal authority. King Xerxes sat upon this throne in the full regalia of his imperial office, conducting the routine business of governing an empire that required constant attention and decision-making. The king, who had once been captivated by Esther's beauty, was now absorbed in matters of state that affected millions of subjects across thousands of miles of territory. Satraps waited with reports from distant provinces, military commanders sought approval for strategic deployments, and court officials presented administrative decisions that required royal ratification. The sight that greeted Esther as she paused at the entrance to the inner court was both magnificent and terrifying. Here was the man who held her life in his hands, surrounded by the symbols and substance of power that could reshape the destiny of nations with a gesture. The husband who had once shown her such tender affection was now the absolute monarch whose mood and whim would determine whether she lived to see another sunset. For a moment that felt like an eternity, Esther stood motionless at the threshold of the inner court, knowing that her next step would irrevocably commit her to a course of action from which there could be no retreat. Behind her lay the safety of royal quarters where she could live in comfort and luxury, while her people marched toward their appointed destruction. Before her lay either death or the chance to serve as the instrument of their deliverance. The decision that had been made during 3 days of fasting and prayer now had to be implemented through the simple act of placing one foot in front of the other. With a courage that came not from her own strength but from absolute dependence on the God of Israel, Esther stepped into the inner court and began walking toward the throne where her fate would be decided. The reaction to her uninvited appearance was immediate and electric. Conversations ceased mid-sentence as courtiers recognized the unprecedented nature of what they were witnessing. Guards tensed as they processed the fact that someone had violated the most fundamental protocol of Persian court life. Even the king himself looked up from the documents he had been reviewing, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to surprise as he recognized his queen approaching without having been summoned. The silence that descended upon the inner court was more profound than any sound that had ever echoed through its marble halls. In that moment of suspended time, everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that could alter the course of history. The woman walking across the intricate stonework toward the black marble throne was not merely risking her own life, but potentially triggering events that could reshape the political landscape of the entire Persian Empire. King Xerxes' reaction to his queen's uninvited appearance was complex and layered with emotions that reflected both his personal feelings for Esther and his understanding of the political implications of the moment. The man who had fallen in love with her beauty and grace was also the monarch who could not allow challenges to royal protocol to go unpunished without undermining the very foundations of imperial authority. For what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the king studied his queen's face as she approached his throne. He saw there something that transcended the beauty that had first captured his attention, a determination and gravity that spoke of purposes far weightier than any personal desire for his company. This was not the capricious whim of a bored royal wife, but the desperate mission of someone who had been driven to risk everything for reasons that remained mysterious. It was in that moment of recognition, the understanding that Esther's violation of court protocol was motivated by necessity rather than presumption, that King Xerxes made the decision that would save not only his queen's life but potentially the lives of hundreds of thousands of his subjects. Slowly, deliberately, and with a gesture that every person in the inner court recognized as an act of extraordinary royal grace, the king extended the golden scepter toward his approaching queen. The sight of that golden scepter reaching toward her was the most beautiful thing Esther had ever seen. The ornate rod that symbolized royal authority and divine approval was transformed in that moment into an instrument of deliverance, a bridge across the chasm that separated condemned criminal from royal favor. The queen, who had risked everything on the hope that her husband's love might overcome his adherence to protocol, now saw that hope vindicated in the most dramatic possible way. As Esther touched the tip of the golden scepter in the gesture that officially acknowledged the king's pardon for her transgression, she felt a surge of gratitude that went far beyond relief at her own survival. The God of Israel had not only preserved her life, but had demonstrated his power to move the heart of the most powerful man on earth. The first phase of her desperate mission had succeeded beyond anything she had dared to hope. King Xerxes' words to his queen reflected both his genuine affection for her and his curiosity about what could have motivated such an unprecedented action. "What do you wish, Queen Esther?" he asked, his voice carrying both warmth and authority. "What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom." The offer was not mere rhetorical flourish, but a genuine expression of royal favour that reflected the depth of Xerxes' feelings for his queen. In the context of Persian royal culture, the promise of half the kingdom was the highest expression of generosity that a monarch could make, indicating complete trust and unlimited willingness to grant whatever favour might be requested. But Esther's response revealed a careful strategy that she had developed during her 3 days of preparation, a plan that demonstrated both wisdom and understanding of the complex political dynamics that surrounded her crisis. Instead of immediately revealing her Jewish identity and pleading for her people's lives, she chose a more subtle approach that would draw both the king and Haman into a situation where the truth could be revealed under circumstances that maximized her chances of success. "If it pleases the king," Esther replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting, "let the king and Haman come today to the banquet that I have prepared for him." The invitation was simultaneously humble and strategic, offering the king the pleasure of a private feast, while ensuring that Haman would be present when she eventually revealed the true purpose of her mission. The choice to invite Haman to this crucial banquet was perhaps the most brilliant aspect of Esther's strategy. Rather than forcing the king to choose between his queen's word and his prime minister's counsel in some abstract discussion of policy, she was creating a scenario where Haman would be present to hear the accusations against him and defend himself if he could. This approach demonstrated both her political sophistication and her confidence that the truth would ultimately vindicate her cause. King Xerxes' immediate acceptance of his queen's invitation revealed both his delight at her attention and his complete lack of suspicion about her motives. "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said," the king commanded, his voice carrying the authority that could summon the highest officials of the empire on a moment's notice. Within hours, the most elaborate royal banquet chamber was being prepared for a meal that would prove far more significant than any of its participants could imagine. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace complex, Haman received the royal summons with feelings that mixed triumph with curiosity. The Prime Minister, who had spent recent weeks orchestrating the destruction of Persian Jewry, now found himself invited to dine privately with the King and Queen, an honour that suggested his standing at court had reached even greater heights than he had previously enjoyed. As Haman prepared for the royal banquet, his thoughts turned naturally to the glorious future that seemed to stretch before him. The edict authorising Jewish genocide was already distributing throughout the empire. His position as Prime Minister appeared more secure than ever, and now he was being honoured with private access to the royal couple. The only remaining irritation in his otherwise perfect existence was the continued presence of Mordecai at the palace gates, still refusing to bow despite the death warrant hanging over his head. The banquet itself was a masterpiece of royal entertainment, featuring delicacies from every corner of the Persian Empire and wines that had been aged in cellars that predated the current dynasty. Esther presided over the meal with all the grace and charm that had first won the king's heart, while Haman basked in the honour of being included in such an intimate royal gathering. Yet throughout the elaborate meal, those present sensed an undercurrent of tension that seemed at odds with the festive atmosphere. Esther's conversation was perfectly polite and appropriately entertaining, but there was something in her manner that suggested deeper purposes were at work. The Queen, who had risked her life to arrange this gathering, was clearly building towards some revelation that would justify the extraordinary risk she had taken. As the evening progressed and wine loosened tongues throughout the banquet chamber, King Xerxes finally asked the question that had been building throughout the meal. "What is your petition, Queen Esther?" he inquired, his voice carrying both affection and genuine curiosity. "It shall be granted you." "And what is your request?" "Up to half the kingdom." "It shall be done." The moment had arrived when Esther could have revealed everything: her Jewish identity, Haman's genocidal plot, and the desperate situation that had driven her to risk her life for her people's survival. But once again, her response demonstrated the careful strategy that she had developed during her preparation. Instead of immediate revelation, she chose to extend the tension and create an even more dramatic setting for the truth to emerge. "My petition and request is this," Esther replied, her words carefully measured to build anticipation rather than provide resolution. "If I have found favour in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfil my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." The decision to postpone her revelation for another day was perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated aspect of Esther's entire strategy. By creating a second banquet and extending the timeline of suspense, she was ensuring that both the king and Haman would have additional time to contemplate the significance of her unusual behaviour. The curiosity that had been aroused by her unprecedented appearance in the inner court would now have 24 hours to intensify before being satisfied. Haman left the first banquet in a state of euphoria that bordered on the manic. The Prime Minister, who had been elevated to unprecedented heights of power and honour, now found himself the repeated guest of the royal couple, enjoying privileges that no other court official could claim. As he made his way through the palace corridors toward his own quarters, his mind raced with plans for capitalizing on this latest evidence of royal favour. But Haman's joy was poisoned by the sight that greeted him as he passed through the king's gate on his way home. There, in his accustomed position, sat Mordecai the Jew, still refusing to rise or show any sign of respect despite everything that had transpired over recent weeks. The Prime Minister, who had just dined with royalty, found his triumph soured by the stubborn defiance of one man who would not acknowledge his supremacy. The contrast between Haman's exultation over his royal honours and his rage at Mordecai's continued defiance revealed the psychological instability that lay beneath his apparent success. The man who possessed power second only to the king himself was tormented by the refusal of one minor court official to bow in his presence. The hatred that had driven him to pursue genocide was intensified rather than satisfied by his growing influence and authority. Returning to his own palace, Haman immediately summoned his wife Zeresh and all his friends to share in his triumph, and receive their congratulations on his unprecedented honours. Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king, the court chroniclers recorded, noting how the Prime Minister's celebration of his own achievements bordered on the obsessive. But even as Haman recounted his various successes and honours, his satisfaction was undermined by his fixation on the one man who refused to acknowledge his greatness. "Yet all this avails me nothing," he concluded bitterly, "so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." The confession revealed the poverty of a soul that could find no contentment, despite possessing wealth, power, and honour beyond most men's dreams. It was Haman's wife Zeresh who proposed the solution that would transform his psychological torment into immediate action. "Let a gallows be made 50 cubits high," she suggested, "and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it, then go merrily with the king to the banquet." The recommendation was both practical and symbolic. By executing Mordecai publicly and dramatically, Haman could eliminate the source of his irritation, while simultaneously demonstrating to any other potential dissidents the consequences of defying his authority. The gallows that Haman ordered constructed during the night was a monument to hatred that rose 75 feet into the air, designed to be visible from every quarter of the city. This was not merely an execution device, but a statement of power, a declaration that the Prime Minister's authority was absolute and his vengeance inescapable. The man who had already arranged for the destruction of every Jew in the Persian Empire was now preparing to add a theatrical element to his campaign of genocide. As Haman supervised the construction of Mordecai's gallows under cover of darkness, he was unaware that forces beyond his control or comprehension were already at work to ensure that his evil schemes would result in his own destruction. The same divine providence that had positioned Esther on the Persian throne and moved the king's heart to extend the golden scepter was about to demonstrate that those who plot against God's people inevitably become victims of their own malice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal whether evil could triumph through political manipulation and royal authority, or whether the God of Israel still possessed the power to turn the schemes of the wicked back upon their own heads. The suspense that Esther had carefully built through her strategic banquets was about to give way to revelations that would transform the political landscape of the Persian Empire and determine the survival of an entire people. The trap was tightening for both victim and villain, but the ultimate question remained unanswered. Which would prove stronger, the accumulated power of human evil, or the hidden hand of divine justice working through the courage of one young woman who had learned that sometimes we come to positions of influence for such a time as this. That night, as Haman's 75-foot gallows rose like a monument to hatred against the star-filled sky above Susa, King Xerxes found himself in the grip of an insomnia so profound that no amount of wine or entertainment could bring him rest. The monarch who ruled over 127 provinces with absolute authority discovered that sleep, the most basic human need, remained beyond the reach of imperial command. He tossed restlessly on his royal bed, his mind churning with thoughts that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The king's sleeplessness was far from unusual in the high-pressure environment of Persian court life, where the burdens of governing a vast empire could keep even the most experienced ruler awake through the longest nights. But this particular bout of insomnia carried an intensity that seemed to transcend normal political anxieties. Something was stirring in the invisible realm that governs human affairs, forces beyond mortal comprehension, working to ensure that evil would not triumph through mere political manipulation. Unable to find rest through conventional means, Xerxes commanded that the Book of Records, the chronicles of his reign, be brought to his bedchamber and read aloud. The decision was not unusual. Persian kings often used the recitation of their achievements as a form of entertainment during sleepless nights, finding satisfaction in recounting the victories and accomplishments that had marked their reigns. What the king could not have known was that this seemingly random choice would set in motion a series of events that would completely reverse the deadly trap that Haman had been preparing for Mordecai. The scribe who was summoned to read from the royal chronicles was a consummate professional who understood that his task was not merely to recite information, but to entertain a restless monarch whose mood could shift from boredom to anger with dangerous speed. As he opened the massive volumes that contained the official record of Xerxes' reign, he selected passages that would highlight royal wisdom and demonstrate the king's skill in rewarding loyal service and punishing treachery. It was in this context that the scribe's voice fell upon a passage that had been recorded years earlier, but forgotten in the press of subsequent events. In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, the scribe read in the measured tones that characterized official court recitations, 2 of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. The king's attention was immediately captured by this reference to an assassination plot that he remembered only vaguely despite its potentially fatal consequences. As the scribe continued reading, the details of the conspiracy came flooding back. How 2 trusted palace guards had planned to murder their royal master, how their plot had been discovered and reported, and how their execution had served as a warning to any other potential traitors within the palace hierarchy. But it was the next part of the chronicle that stopped King Xerxes cold, and sent his mind racing with implications that he had never before considered. And Mordecai told Queen Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name, the scribe continued, his voice maintaining its professional neutrality despite the explosive nature of what he was reading. The Jewish court official whose continued defiance of Haman had become such a source of tension throughout the palace had actually saved the king's life through his vigilance and loyalty. "What honour or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" the king demanded, his voice cutting through the quiet of the bedchamber with sudden urgency. The question revealed both his surprise at the information and his immediate recognition that a grave injustice had been allowed to persist. In Persian culture, the failure to properly reward those who preserved royal life was not merely poor governance, but a violation of cosmic order that could bring divine displeasure upon the entire kingdom. The servants who attended the king exchanged nervous glances as they realized the implications of his question. "Nothing has been done for him," they replied, their voices carefully modulated to avoid any suggestion that they were criticizing royal oversight. The admission hung in the air like an accusation, highlighting a failure of gratitude that contradicted everything the Persian Empire claimed to represent about justice and proper recognition of service. King Xerxes' reaction to this revelation was immediate and decisive. The monarch who had been kept awake by mysterious restlessness now found himself energized by a sense of purpose that demanded immediate action. The man who had saved his life years earlier was not only unrewarded, but was actually the target of hostility from the very Prime Minister who should have been ensuring proper recognition of such service. As dawn broke over the palace complex, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to herald a day of unusual significance, King Xerxes prepared to rectify what now appeared to be a cosmic injustice. But even as he contemplated how to properly honour Mordecai's life-saving service, the sound of footsteps in the outer court announced the arrival of someone seeking an early audience with the king. Haman had arrived at the palace before sunrise, his mind focused entirely on securing royal permission for Mordecai's execution on the towering gallows that now dominated the skyline of Susa. The Prime Minister, who had spent a sleepless night supervising the construction of his instrument of vengeance, was eager to complete his triumph by obtaining the king's approval for its use. In his fevered imagination, he could already envision Mordecai's body swaying in the morning breeze while he proceeded to the queen's second banquet as the undisputed master of the Persian Empire. "Who is in the court?" King Xerxes inquired, and his servants confirmed that Haman was waiting in the outer court for an audience. The timing seemed perfect from the king's perspective. Here was his highest-ranking official, available to help devise a suitable reward for the man who had saved the royal life. What Xerxes could not have known was that the person seeking audience was the very man who had been plotting to destroy the lifesaver he now wanted to honour. "Let him come in," the king commanded, and Haman entered the royal presence with the confidence of a man who believed the fates were aligning perfectly to serve his purposes. The Prime Minister, who had risen to unprecedented heights of power and authority, approached his sovereign with the expectation that his morning request would be granted as readily as all his previous demands had been accommodated. But before Haman could present his request for permission to execute Mordecai, King Xerxes posed a question that would transform the entire trajectory of their conversation and ultimately determine the Prime Minister's fate. "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honour?" the king asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate and comprehensive advice. The question sent Haman's imagination soaring into realms of grandiosity that revealed both his limitless ego and his fundamental misunderstanding of his position within the cosmic order. The Prime Minister, who had convinced himself that he was indispensable to the Persian Empire, immediately assumed that he was the man whom the king delighted to honour. After all, who else could possibly merit such royal favour? Who else had achieved such heights of power and influence within the imperial hierarchy? Haman's response to the king's question was a masterpiece of unconscious irony, a detailed description of honours so elaborate that they bordered on royal prerogatives normally reserved for the king himself. "For the man whom the king delights to honour," he began, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone describing his own deepest fantasies, "let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head." The honours that Haman described went far beyond normal recognition for faithful service, and entered the realm of quasi-royal status that would have been shocking in its presumption, under normal circumstances. The royal robe that had touched the king's own body, the horse that had carried the monarch in state processions, the royal crest that symbolised imperial authority, all of these represented privileges that elevated the recipient almost to the level of royalty itself. "Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes," Haman continued, his excitement building as he elaborated his vision of ultimate recognition. "Let them robe the man whom the king delights to honour, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honour.'" The image that Haman painted was one of ultimate public triumph, a spectacle that would demonstrate to every citizen of Susa that the honoured individual enjoyed royal favour beyond anything previously witnessed. The procession through the city square would serve as a declaration that this person had achieved a status that placed him second only to the king himself in the hierarchy of imperial honour and recognition. King Xerxes' reaction to this elaborate proposal was immediate approval, but his next words would transform Haman's vision of personal triumph into the most humiliating experience of his entire life. "Hurry! Take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested," the king commanded, his voice carrying the authority that could reshape destinies with a single sentence. "And do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have suggested." The impact of these words on Haman was devastating beyond description. The Prime Minister, who had entered the royal presence expecting to arrange Mordecai's execution, was now being commanded to personally honour the man he hated most in all the world. The elaborate ceremony that he had designed as his own ultimate triumph was being bestowed upon the very person whose destruction had become his primary obsession. But perhaps most crushing of all was the realization that there was no escape from the king's command. Haman's own words had created the framework for Mordecai's honour, and any attempt to modify or refuse the assignment would reveal the depth of his hatred for a man whom the king was determined to reward. The Prime Minister, who had achieved unprecedented power through political manipulation, was now trapped by his own advice and forced to become the instrument of his enemy's exaltation. The spectacle that followed was one of the most dramatic reversals in recorded history, a complete inversion of the power dynamics that had seemed so firmly established just hours earlier. Haman, who had spent the night supervising the construction of gallows for Mordecai's execution, now found himself clothing that same man in royal robes and leading him through the streets of Susa in a procession of honour that proclaimed divine favour to the entire city. The psychological torment that Haman experienced during this forced celebration of Mordecai's virtue was excruciating to observe. Every step of the procession was agony for a man whose pride had been built on the assumption of his own superiority and indispensability. To be reduced to the role of herald for someone he despised was a humiliation that cut deeper than any physical punishment could have achieved. "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honour," Haman was forced to proclaim repeatedly as the procession made its way through the crowded streets of the capital. Each repetition of these words was like a knife thrust into his own heart, a public acknowledgement that his judgment had been catastrophically wrong and his hatred completely unjustified. The reaction of the crowd that witnessed this unprecedented spectacle was a mixture of amazement and confusion that reflected their inability to comprehend what they were seeing. Here was the Prime Minister of the Persian Empire personally honouring a Jewish court official who had been nothing more than a minor administrative official figure in their understanding. The reversal of fortunes was so complete and unexpected that many observers struggled to believe the evidence of their own eyes. For Mordecai himself, the experience was undoubtedly surreal beyond description. The man who had faced the prospect of execution on a towering gallows was now being paraded through the city in royal robes, while his greatest enemy proclaimed his honour to assembled crowds. The vindication was complete and public, a demonstration that the God of Israel could reverse even the most hopeless circumstances when his purposes required such intervention. When the procession was finally completed, and Mordecai had been returned to his customary position at the king's gate, Haman found himself emotionally and psychologically shattered by the morning's events. The Prime Minister, who had begun the day expecting to celebrate his ultimate triumph over his Jewish nemesis, was now forced to confront the reality that forces beyond his control or comprehension were working against his evil schemes. Haman's return to his own house was a study in psychological collapse and growing desperation. The man who had possessed such confidence in his ability to manipulate events to serve his purposes was now beginning to understand that he was trapped in circumstances that seemed to be turning every one of his actions against him. The gallows that he had built for Mordecai's destruction now loomed over his own dwelling like a monument to the futility of opposing divine providence. The consultation with his wife Zeresh and his advisers that followed revealed how completely the morning's events had undermined Haman's confidence and political standing. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, they warned him with the clarity that sometimes comes to those who observe disasters from a safe distance. You will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. The prophecy was delivered with the kind of devastating accuracy that characterizes moments when human wisdom suddenly aligns with divine truth. Haman's advisers, who had encouraged his hatred and supported his genocidal schemes when his power seemed unassailable, now recognized that he was facing forces that transcended normal political calculations. The man who had seemed destined for unlimited power and influence was now revealed as someone whose very survival was in question. But even as Haman processed this dire warning and contemplated its implications for his future, the summons arrived that would bring his crisis to its climax. The royal servants appeared at his door with the command that he was expected immediately at Queen Esther's second banquet, the event he had anticipated as the crown jewel of his week of triumph, but which now felt more like a summons to judgment. As Haman prepared to accompany the royal messengers to what he hoped would still be a celebration of his continued favour, he was unaware that Queen Esther had spent the day in final preparation for the most important performance of her life. The woman who had risked everything to save her people was about to reveal the truth that would determine whether justice or evil would triumph in the Persian Empire. The stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate whether the God of Israel could indeed turn the schemes of the wicked back upon their own heads, and whether one woman's courage could serve as the instrument through which divine justice would be accomplished. The great reversal had begun, but its completion awaited the revelations that would unfold at the Queen's table, where truth would finally emerge from the shadows and evil would face the consequences of its own malicious designs. The evening shadows lengthened across the palace complex as Queen Esther made her final preparations for the banquet that would determine the fate of her people. The woman who had risked her life by approaching the king, uninvited, now faced an even greater challenge, revealing the truth that could either save the Jews of the Persian Empire or seal their destruction through her own execution. As servants arranged the last details of what would prove to be the most consequential meal in Jewish history, Esther found herself drawing strength from the knowledge that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had already begun to work miracles on behalf of his people. The banquet chamber itself was a masterpiece of royal hospitality, adorned with silk tapestries and golden vessels that reflected the wealth and sophistication of Persian court culture. Exotic delicacies from every corner of the empire graced tables that groaned under the weight of culinary artistry, designed to please the most refined palates. The wine that flowed like rivers of liquid amber had been aged in cellars that predated the current dynasty, while entertainment was provided by musicians whose skills represented the finest cultural achievements of a dozen different civilizations. But beneath the glittering surface of royal magnificence lay currents of tension that made the very air seem charged with electricity. King Xerxes arrived in the expansive mood of a monarch who had recently demonstrated his commitment to justice by honouring a loyal subject. Haman appeared in the demeanour of a man struggling to maintain his composure while processing the devastating reversals that had already begun to undermine his position. And Esther presided over it all with the grace of someone who understood that the next few hours would determine whether she would be remembered as the queen who saved her people or as the woman whose courage had destroyed them both. As the meal progressed through its elaborate courses and conversation flowed with the artificial ease that characterizes high-stakes political gatherings, King Xerxes found his curiosity about his queen's mysterious purposes reaching levels that could no longer be contained. The woman who had risked her life to arrange these banquets was clearly building towards some revelation that would justify the extraordinary measures she had taken. "What is your petition, Queen Esther?" the king asked for the third time, his voice carrying both affection and the growing impatience of a powerful man accustomed to having his questions answered directly. "It shall be granted you." "And what is your request?" "Up to half the kingdom. It shall be performed." The moment had arrived when all pretense and strategic delay must end, when the truth that had been hidden for so long must finally emerge into the light where it could either save or destroy everything Esther held dear. The queen who had maintained her secret Jewish identity throughout her reign was about to risk everything on the hope that her husband's love would prove stronger than his prime minister's political influence. "If I have found favour in your sight, O king," Esther began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal, "and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request." The words fell into the banquet chamber like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion that spread outward from their point of impact until they reached every corner of the ornate room. The king's reaction was immediate bewilderment mixed with rising alarm. The woman who had seemed to be preparing some request for personal favour or political advancement was instead pleading for her very life and the survival of some unidentified people with whom she claimed kinship. "For we have been sold," Esther continued, her words building in intensity as she revealed the full scope of the crisis, "my people and I to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." The accusation that she and her people had been sold for destruction carried implications that sent shockwaves through everyone present who understood the political dynamics of the Persian court. Someone with access to royal authority had engineered a genocidal plot that threatened the queen herself, transforming what should have been a matter of imperial security into a direct attack on the royal family. "Had we been sold as male and female slaves," Esther explained with devastating logic, "I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." The distinction she drew between slavery and annihilation revealed both her political sophistication and her understanding of the economic calculations that influenced imperial policy. Slaves retained value that could benefit the royal treasury, but genocide offered no such compensation for the loss of productive subjects. King Xerxes' response to his queen's revelation was explosive in its intensity and immediate in its focus. "Who is he, and where is he, who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" the king demanded, his voice carrying the outrage of a monarch who had discovered that someone had dared to threaten his own wife while claiming to act in his name. The man who had approved Haman's edict without careful consideration now found himself confronting the personal implications of that hasty decision. Esther's response was delivered with the precision of a master strategist, who had planned this moment through 3 days of fasting and months of careful observation. The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman, she declared, her accusation cutting through the elaborate courtesies of royal protocol like a sword through silk. The finger that pointed toward the Prime Minister was steady and unwavering, backed by the moral authority of someone who had risked everything to defend the innocent. The impact of Esther's accusation on Haman was catastrophic beyond description. The Prime Minister, who had entered the banquet expecting to celebrate his continued favour with the royal couple, now found himself exposed as the architect of a plot that threatened the Queen's life. The man who had spent weeks plotting genocide in the shadows was suddenly trapped in the blazing light of royal scrutiny, with no possibility of escape or denial. Haman's reaction to this devastating exposure was a mixture of terror and desperate calculation, as he struggled to comprehend how completely his circumstances had changed. In the space of a few sentences, the political mastermind who had manipulated the king into authorizing genocide was now facing the full fury of a monarch who had discovered that his own wife was among the intended victims. King Xerxes' rage was magnificent and terrible to behold. The explosive fury of absolute power, confronted with evidence of betrayal that struck at the very heart of royal authority and personal relationships. The king who had trusted Haman with unprecedented power and authority now understood that this trust had been systematically violated through schemes that threatened to destroy the woman he loved most. Unable to remain in the presence of such treachery without risking violence that would violate the sacred protocols of royal hospitality, Xerxes rose from the banquet table and stormed into the palace garden to process the full implications of what he'd learned. The king who ruled over 127 provinces found himself needing time and space to comprehend how completely he'd been deceived by the man he'd elevated to supreme power. Left alone with Queen Esther in the banquet chamber, Haman found himself facing the final collapse of everything he had worked to achieve. The Prime Minister who had commanded the obedience of an empire was now reduced to pleading for his life before the very woman whose people he had sought to destroy. The transformation was so complete and devastating that it seemed to represent some cosmic correction of injustice, rather than mere political reversal. In his desperation, Haman threw himself upon the couch where Queen Esther reclined, grasping at her garments in the universal gesture of supplication that transcended cultural boundaries and political distinctions. But this final desperate attempt to secure mercy through personal appeal would prove to be the last mistake in a series of catastrophic miscalculations that had already sealed his fate. King Xerxes returned to the banquet chamber at the precise moment when Haman was physically grasping the queen, provided the final element needed to transform royal anger into irrevocable condemnation. "Will he also assault the queen while I'm in the house?" the king roared, his voice carrying the outrage of a man who had witnessed what appeared to be an attack on his wife's honour, in addition to the revelation of genocidal plotting. The accusation of assault was probably unfair. Haman was clearly pleading for mercy rather than attempting any form of violence. But in the supercharged atmosphere of royal rage and political crisis, appearances mattered more than intentions. The Prime Minister, who had already been exposed as a traitor, was now perceived as someone who would violate the most sacred protocols of royal hospitality and feminine honour. The execution that followed was as swift as it was symbolically perfect. As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face, the court chroniclers recorded, noting the ritual that marked condemned prisoners and prepared them for immediate death. But it was the location chosen for Haman's execution that transformed his punishment into a masterpiece of poetic justice that would be remembered for generations. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, the official records noted with devastating irony. This 75-foot monument to hatred that the Prime Minister had constructed as the instrument of his enemy's destruction became instead the mechanism of his own demise. The man who had cast lots to determine the most auspicious timing for Jewish genocide found his own fate sealed by the very gallows he had built to satisfy his personal vendetta. The sight of Haman's body swaying from the gallows that had been intended for Mordecai sent shockwaves throughout Susa that reverberated across the entire Persian Empire. Palace servants who had grown accustomed to the Prime Minister's arrogance and cruelty struggled to comprehend how completely his fortunes had reversed in the space of a single day. The man who had seemed to possess unlimited power and royal favour was now a corpse hanging from his own instrument of vengeance. But Haman's execution, satisfying as it was from the perspective of poetic justice, did not solve the fundamental crisis that had prompted Esther's desperate intervention. The edict authorizing Jewish genocide remained in effect throughout all 127 provinces of the Persian Empire, and the irreversible nature of Persian law meant that even the king himself could not simply cancel the death warrant that had already been distributed to every corner of his realm. King Xerxes' solution to this legal crisis revealed both his genuine affection for his queen and his understanding of the administrative complexities that governed imperial policy. Since the first edict could not be revoked, a second edict would be issued that would effectively neutralize its impact by authorizing the Jews to defend themselves against any who attempted to carry out the original order. Write you also for the Jews, as it pleases you, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring, Xerxes commanded Mordecai, who had been summoned to the palace and elevated to the position of prime minister that Haman's execution had left vacant. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring, no one can revoke. The irony of Mordecai's elevation was profound and symbolically perfect. The Jewish court official who had been marked for death on Haman's gallows was now wearing the signet ring that authorized him to issue edicts throughout the Persian Empire. The man whose refusal to bow had triggered the entire crisis was now second only to the king in political authority and administrative power. The new edict that Mordecai composed was comprehensive in its scope and decisive in its language, designed to ensure that Jews throughout the empire would understand both their rights and their opportunities for self-defense. The king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions. The language deliberately echoed Haman's original genocidal edict, but with the crucial difference that authorization was now being given to the intended victims rather than their would-be oppressors. The Jews who had spent months anticipating their destruction could now organize legitimate resistance to any attempts to carry out the original death warrant. The date specified for this reversal was the same 13th day of the 12th month that Haman had chosen through his casting of lots for the original massacre. The day that had been appointed for Jewish annihilation would instead become the day of their deliverance, transforming the Prime Minister's carefully calculated timing into the mechanism of his own plot's defeat. The reaction throughout the Persian Empire to the publication of this counter-edict was immediate and dramatic. Jewish communities that had spent months in mourning and desperation suddenly found themselves authorized not only to defend their lives, but to take the offensive against anyone who attempted to carry out Haman's genocidal instructions. The people who had been marked for death were now empowered to become the instruments of judgment against their enemies. But perhaps more significantly, the broader population of the Persian Empire began to reassess their positions regarding the Jewish communities in their midst. The dramatic reversal of Haman's fortunes and Mordecai's elevation to the highest levels of government had demonstrated that the Jews possessed divine protection that transcended normal political calculations. Many who had originally planned to participate in the authorized genocide now found themselves switching sides rather than risk opposing a people who obviously enjoyed supernatural favour. And many of the people of the land became Jews, the chroniclers recorded, noting how the dramatic reversals had convinced entire communities that the God of Israel was more powerful than any earthly authority. The conversion was not merely nominal, but reflected genuine recognition that the Jewish faith offered access to divine power that could overturn seemingly impossible circumstances. When the appointed day finally arrived, the anticipated massacre turned into a complete rout of Jewish enemies throughout the Persian Empire. Instead of helpless victims being slaughtered by their neighbours, organised Jewish forces systematically eliminated those who had planned to participate in their destruction. The day that Haman had calculated would mark the final solution to the Jewish problem became instead the day when Jewish survival was permanently secured throughout the Persian realm. The victory was comprehensive and decisive, extending far beyond mere survival to include the complete elimination of organised anti-Jewish sentiment throughout the empire. The Jews struck all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, the official records noted, documenting how thoroughly the tables had been turned on those who had planned genocide. In Susa itself, the victory included the execution of Haman's 10 sons, who had inherited their father's position as leaders of the anti-Jewish faction, and had undoubtedly been planning to continue his work of persecution. Their deaths on the same gallows that had claimed their father provided a final symbolic completion of the justice that had been set in motion by Esther's courage and Mordecai's faithfulness. The establishment of the Feast of Purim emerged naturally from the Jewish community's need to commemorate and celebrate the miraculous deliverance they had experienced. The name itself was derived from the Purim, the lots that Haman had cast to determine the timing of his intended genocide, transforming the instrument of his evil planning into a perpetual reminder of how God could turn the schemes of the wicked back upon their own heads. Mordecai and Esther's joint letter, establishing Purim as an annual celebration, was carefully crafted to ensure that future generations would understand both the historical significance of their deliverance and its ongoing relevance for Jewish identity throughout the diaspora. To confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, the letter declared, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. The celebration itself was designed to capture the full emotional range of the experience that Persian Jews had endured, from the depths of despair, when annihilation seemed certain, to the heights of joy, when deliverance proved complete. The reading of the scroll of Esther became the central element of the observance, ensuring that every generation would hear again the story of how an orphan girl had become the instrument of her people's salvation. But perhaps most importantly, the establishment of Purim recognized the theological significance of events that had unfolded without any explicit divine intervention. Unlike other Jewish festivals that commemorated obvious miracles such as the parting of the Red Sea or the provision of manna in the wilderness, Purim celebrated God's hidden providence, working through natural circumstances and human courage to accomplish supernatural purposes. The absence of God's name from the entire story of Esther was not an oversight but a deliberate literary device that highlighted how divine purposes could be accomplished through seemingly ordinary events and human decisions. The God who had spoken audibly to Moses and appeared visibly to Elijah was revealed in Esther's story as the hidden orchestrator of coincidences and the silent shaper of human hearts and circumstances. Queen Esther's role in these events was memorialized not only through the annual celebration, but through her permanent place in the Jewish consciousness as a model of courage and faithfulness under pressure. The orphan who had been raised by Mordecai's loving care had become the saviour of her entire people, demonstrating that divine purposes could be accomplished through the most unlikely instruments when they were willing to risk everything for others' welfare. The broader impact of these events extended far beyond their immediate significance for Persian Jewry. The story of how one woman's courage had overturned genocidal plotting became a source of hope and inspiration for oppressed peoples throughout history who found themselves facing seemingly impossible odds. Esther's example proved that individual faithfulness could have consequences that reshaped the destiny of nations. The theological implications of the Purim story continued to resonate through subsequent generations as Jewish communities faced new challenges and threats to their survival. The pattern established in the Persian Empire, that God's people could face apparent annihilation yet find deliverance through divine providence working behind the scenes, became a template for understanding how divine protection operated even in the darkest circumstances. The legacy of Queen Esther's courage extended beyond the Jewish community to influence broader human understanding of moral responsibility and civic engagement. Her decision to risk her privileged position for the sake of others who shared her heritage became a model for how individuals with access to power and influence should respond when confronted with systematic injustice. As generations passed and the Persian Empire gave way to other powers, the celebration of Purim continued to remind Jewish communities throughout the world that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob remained actively involved in protecting his people from their enemies. The lots that Haman had cast in his attempt to determine the most favourable timing for genocide had instead become the foundation for an annual celebration of divine faithfulness and human courage. The story that had begun with an orphan girl's elevation to royal status had evolved into a permanent testament to the power of providence, working through ordinary people who choose to act with extraordinary courage when circumstances demand such action. The queen who had risked everything for such a time as this had secured not only the survival of her people, but a legacy that would inspire hope and courage for countless generations facing their own impossible challenges. In the end, the triumph celebrated through Purim was not merely the victory of Jews over their enemies, but the vindication of faith over fear, courage over comfort, and divine justice over human evil. The hidden hand of God had written redemption into history through the willing cooperation of human hearts that chose to trust completely in purposes larger than their own survival and more important than their personal safety. The feast established by Mordecai and Esther became a permanent reminder that no situation is too hopeless, no enemy too powerful, and no scheme too comprehensive to be overturned by the God who works all things according to his will and accomplishes his purposes through those who are willing to trust him completely, even when the cost appears to be everything they hold dear.